One of the big characteristics of the 1920s were the social issues that were going on during the time. And a lot of these social issues contributed to American society that we see today. So what I want you to keep in mind as we're looking through this presentation is our guiding question: what were some social issues of the Roaring Twenties? And I want you to also be keeping in mind how those social issues of the 1920s influenced the United States today. So one of the big first things that we're going to see, and this is going to be the first time that we see this in the court system, is this battle between science and religion. And this came over the ideas of teaching evolution. So our fundamentalist religious groups, and fundamentalists are people who take the Bible literally, they take it word for word. We're really struggling with the ideas of evolution and Darwinism, which were things that were really debated and discussed during the 1920s. So in 1925, Tennessee becomes the first state to actually outright ban the teaching of evolution. Said it was illegal, you couldn't do it. So what ends up happening is that the ACLU, which is the American Civil Liberties Union, decides that this idea of restricting the teaching of evolution is against the First Amendment. So they decided that they were going to take on this issue. So they began looking for teachers who were going to continue teaching despite this law. So they found a teacher, John Scopes was his name, who was teaching evolution in his science classes. So he was actually charged with teaching evolution in class illegally, and there was a pretty big court case about it. It's called the Scopes monkey trial. We're going to look at some of the specifics of the Scopes monkey trial tomorrow in class. But the outcome of this essentially was that Scopes was found guilty and it was charged. He was fined $100. So it was not a huge fine by any means. As a matter of fact, it was a pretty minimal fine for a court case this big, but it left some wiggle room for whether or not evolution should actually be taught in schools. But once again, a huge issue here. And it received national attention. People were as wrapped up in this idea of teaching evolution as they are gay marriage, which we know is a huge debate today. So women in the 1920s are going to take on a completely different role than what we saw during World War I and during the late 1800s. So Americans, of course, after World War I were really looking for some fun. So one of the ways that they expressed this idea of fun was women began to express their independence. They wanted more freedoms. They wanted the right to vote. They wanted more employment. They wanted to be able to drive and escape their homes whenever they wanted to in their new cars. So we're going to start to see the emergence of the flapper. And this flapper was typically a younger woman who really embraced the idea of new fashions and these urban attitudes. So going out late at night, wearing short dresses, dancing, smoking cigarettes, drinking during Prohibition, all of these things were things that flappers were doing. And women previous to this time period were really discouraged from doing these things. So it's this idea of this emancipated woman. And we're going to look at some pictures of flappers in class tomorrow because this is really a huge characterization of the 1920s. So as a result of that changing role of women, the American family is going to start to change pretty dramatically. We're going to see a decrease of births, basically, for several decades before the 1920s. And that's going to be the result of several things. It's going to be the result of war. It's going to be the result of women being out of the home and socializing and having these extra rights. So as a result of this, just the idea of the family kind of changed, and it's going to be this modern family, I know, show that you've all watched, I'm sure, but the ideas of these modern families are going to come about. So instead of being these pre-arranged financial marriages are actually going to be based on romance and love. Women are going to start to manage the household finances. And then children weren't considered laborers or wage earners. They were actually, developing people, needed nurturing, and education is going to see a really big push during this time period as well. So there were a lot of developments in education. We're going to start to see compulsory or required education really pushed even throughout the South, which had not been pushed before this time period. Enrollment in high school quadrupled between 1914 and 1926. And public schools were having to make that shift into not only educating, higher class males, but they were trying to educate some of these immigrant groups as well. One big result in this increase in education was the expansion of news coverage. So more and more people are going to be able to read, which was a great thing. As a result of more people being literate, newspaper circulations are really, really going to increase. And we're going to start to see mass circulation magazines for one of the first times in history too. Any family could afford to have a newspaper or could afford to get these magazines, and oftentimes, learned how to run their households or learned fashions from those magazines. So by the end of the 20s, 10 American magazines, including Reader's Digest, which is still around today, and Time magazine, are going to have circulations that are over 2 million, which is a big percentage of American families. And alongside with the development of magazines and newspaper, we're going to start to see radio increasing as well. It was the most powerful communication tool to emerge in the 1920s. And every living room had a radio. And it's very similar to how TVs are today. People would crowd around the radios to hear news stories or to hear what was going on in the world. News was delivered faster and to a larger audience. And then Americans could also hear the voice of their president for the first time or hear the announcing of the World Series. So those kind of mass appeal events are going to start to become a really important part of the everyday American life. And then as a result of the radio and the magazines and the newspaper, we're finally going to start to see the development of the American hero. And we see a lot of that in today, your athletes and your actors and your singers and, anything along those lines. So in 1929, Americans are going to spend $4.5 billion on entertainment. Sports was a big part of that, just like it's a big part of our modern day society as well. Baseball games are going to be one of the big things that people get really, really excited about, and people are going to start to crowd into those baseball stadiums whenever they can. Babe Ruth is going to be one of the first big examples of the American hero. Larger than life baseball player. He played for the Yankees, and he is going to hit 60 home runs in 1927. And keep in mind, guys, that this is before we start to see these, these drugs that enhance your performance. So Babe Ruth was a legit hero to a lot of people in the United States during this time period. So I want you to keep in mind how all of these different social aspects influence culture in the 1920s, and then just overall influence the culture of the United States. Keep all of that in mind so that you're ready for our class tomorrow, and I will see y'all then.